Welcome to Raw Take, everyone, the lifeline to your unfiltered media experience. I'm your host, Gion Thomas, and we got a great show for y'all today. Today, we got Ben Lowery, two-time state convention delegate for Bernie Sanders, and he's an information undergrad at UTSA. How you doing, man?
Hey, I'm doing great. It's really good to be on the show with you.
Just to give a little background about Ben, we worked together on the Mike Siegel for Congress campaign. From that campaign, I've met so many great people, and so I definitely had to get Ben on to get his perspective on Leninism and why we need the word socialism. So Ben, before we get into that, I just want to ask, man. So I know you had told me this before, but how was it being a delegate for Bernie Sanders?
Yeah, so it was honestly a really powerful experience. Um, feeling like for the first, I was my first time being involved as a delegate for Bernie Sanders. I was one of the youngest people at the convention. I was only 18 years old. Now I'm 23, and it's just crazy to see how far our politics have come in that time period. Sometimes it feels like it's one step forward and two steps back, but I think it's really the other way around. I think it's um, two steps forward, one step back, and I think we are still moving forward. MLK said something along the lines of how the arc of progress is long through history, but it bends towards justice. And I think that's totally true. I think there are some very real, tangible victories that we've made along the way, and I think those are things we've got to celebrate. While at the same time, acknowledging the way the system is so broken, and how much further we still have to go, because that is another takeaway on the opposite side of that coin. When I was at the state convention, was just I got to connect with these Bernie people and people that were really passionate about changing things for the better. But then I also saw some of the worst corruption. So, it's both sides of that equation.
Yeah, yeah. I find, man, so much with politics, it's always a two-way street.
Yeah.
I mean, it just is, and one of the things that we always mention on the show is how bad corruption is, and how that's the most existential threat that we have to face is corruption and really money in politics and how that affects everything. But let's talk about Leninism, man. Let's talk about the word socialism. I know these are scary words, bro. People hear those words and they get scared. They don't, but fear comes from a lack of knowledge. People don't.
Yeah, they shouldn't.
Exactly. I mean, especially if you look at America, we have so many things that is social, like Social Security, bridges, roads. I mean, Medicaid. It's just so much. The list goes on and on. And so,
Yeah.
give us your take on Leninism and what it means and all that.
Okay, so I'm not an expert on Lenin, but I have done, I think, a really deep dive into The State and Revolution by Vladimir Lenin. So, based on my own political experience, the different history courses I've learned, my own self-education, I do have 10 takeaways of how I think this book can still be relevant in 21st century American politics. And I guess one of the first things we got to do, right, is define Leninism. So I do, if you'll excuse me, I would like to read a couple of quotes from this book throughout this conversation at length, just because I want to make sure that, one mistake I see a lot of people on the left when they're trying to talk about theory is they talk around a lot of theory. But I want to make sure that this is really educational and informative to anybody watching this. so that they can actually hear the things that Marx and Lenin said and kind of make up their mind for themselves, about this whole conversation we're having, and that we're not just, putting words in anybody's mouths from beyond the grave. You know what I'm saying? So Leninism, as it stood back during Lenin's lifetime, I believe his philosophy was, it existed as a counter to revisionism and specifically to liberalism. Um, Leninism was an attempt by Vladimir Lenin to bring Marxism away from some of the what he saw as watering it down, and making it reactionary, and trying to bring that revolutionary spirit, back to the core of that political ideology. So on page 23, Vladimir Lenin, he makes the point that liberal democracy and, those things that are counter-revolutionary, they're really defined by the state machine, and bureaucracy. It says right here on page 23, two institutions most characteristic of this, liberal or conservative state machine are the bureaucracy and the standing army. And by bureaucracy, he doesn't mean just like fire departments, the police force. He doesn't mean schools, road, bridges. He's specifically referring to this time, in global history where you had these, really entrenched political machines, not just in the USA, but in Russia and all of these emerging Republican societies, where Lenin was observing these, spoils system, and these, what he called talking shops, where you had, these parliaments, and then you had the bureaucracy, through the executive, which were totally distinct. And he felt like, a big problem with these, Republican institutions, and what made them so, opposed to the working class, was the fact that the working class had virtually no control over them. And so that's something that he was trying to fix, and that's why he calls over and over again to break this state machine of bureaucracy. To Lenin, being against bureaucracy isn't totally dissolving, these committees, roads, and bridges, but it's a question of making them accountable to the voters, and the people actually living in the society, the workers. That's who he's wanting to empower. Those ideas are what contrasts with, more liberal as opposed to left-wing conceptions of how democracy is supposed to function.
Yeah. So from what you're saying, what I'm understanding it as, it's just like he was just basically for the workers. He was for the working class man. He was for the working class man and woman. I feel like, and I mean, I think you can see it so much in our politics today. You see people on MSNBC, CNN, and Fox, and like there's a disconnect. Like the whole conversation with a $15 minimum wage or the survival checks. I mean, those people are disconnected from the common reality of the working class person, because to them they're like, oh, $2,000, you should have that saved up. You should because these people make so much money. There's a big disconnect.
Yeah, absolutely, and that goes back to, people will, again, they'll question the relevance of something that was written in 1917, but here on page 10, Lenin actually observes about an earlier commentary by, Marx's lifelong, theoretical, partner, comrade. If you're not familiar with Marxism, Marx and Engels, they were both, incredibly essential to the other in developing their own theories. And, Engels said on the subject of, this sort of corruption and really just callousness to the struggle of everyday people throughout the first world. He said, in a democratic republic, wealth exercises its power indirectly, but all more surely. First, by the means of direct corruption of officials, and he calls out specifically America. He says the direct corruption of officials in America, and secondly, by means of, quote, an alliance of the government and the stock exchange, referring to both France and America. And we still absolutely see that today. And that's why, we wonder sometimes why the system's not working for us. And it's because it was designed not to work for us. It is specifically designed to enrich, these capital stakeholders. And that's why, socialism is all about, it's not about just reforming the system and redistributing the power back to the people that have been dispossessed, but it really what it gets to the heart of is questioning in the first place where that power is given to. It's not about redistributing it once it's already in the wrong hands, but it's about lifting up from the outset those workers to really be responsible for their own destinies.
Yeah. Because I mean, dude, you see that here in America. You have people working for slave wages. I mean, servers make $2 and I think it's either $2.15 or $2.75. An hour. And it depends on tips. And so then the owner of the business, it benefits them because they are passing that burden along to the consumer. But then the consumer doesn't even have any money because the economy is so the only person winning is the ruling class, is your managers, your CEOs. And I think that's why Leninism, socialism, that's why this stuff is so important, because it's just giving power back to the people. That's all it is. And I would say I'm probably more like social democratic. Really, honestly, I don't really believe in political labels. To me, political labels are I don't know, because they get so misconstrued, because as we see here in America.
Yeah, no, and that's totally true. And this isn't a new problem. I don't want to totally go off on a tangent, but I think this is really critical to the conversation and understanding the history of socialism. When we talk about socialism, people will always try to say, when progressives in the U.S. Bring up Norway and Sweden and a lot of really successful examples of socialism, there will be people criticizing them on the left, these people that call themselves Maoists or third worldists. They'll say, hey, that's not real socialism. Those people are social democrats. But it's just so ironic to me because, all of these labels, since their inceptions, they've been twisted, used, and abused by various different parties that have radically different goals. And the irony of specifically the word social democrat, you see an argument of social democracy versus democratic socialism. But the histories are so intertwined. There was a really good point that Marx made about it specifically here on page 65. As far as the need to call ourselves socialists, it was actually Engels said. He said, for Marx and myself, it was impossible to use such a loose term as the word social democrat, but, and this was back in 1894, he said, today things are different, and the word social democrat may perhaps pass muster. So even these, radical communists, there's a time and a place where, language kind of breaks down, and it's not so much when you're having political action, the names are infinitely less important than the policy, and that's what Engels continued. He said, the names of real political parties, however, are never wholly appropriate. the party develops while the name stays. And you see that, you see that in Germany with the Social Democrats, and you can see that. I don't know if there's a clearer example than the Democratic Party in the USA, which formerly was the party of slavery. It's the same party name, but this ideology has shifted so many times. The Republican Party, it was founded by, a large faction being radical Republicans, and these people had deep ties to Marxism and communism. I don't know if you knew this, but one of Abraham Lincoln's major generals, one of the most important generals fighting, to keep the South in the Union, I believe his name was August Willich, and he was a communist from the German Civil War. So these aren't new problems, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, man. I think I had read something that Marx had. I don't know if he had talked to Lincoln or if they had some kind of.
Yeah.
I know there was some kind of links of communication between those two.
When Lincoln was elected, Marx congratulated him through letters, and Lincoln was somebody that he did deeply admire for his commitment to democratic centralism, which is again that sort of anti-states' rights mentality that is present through so much Marxism. That's the type of government that Lenin wanted to get back to, instead of people always talking about necessarily this idea that making things more horizontal or decentralized. People, it's kind of a buzzword now. People always talk about decentralization as if that inherently is going to make the system better, but the reality is there's, in a lot of cases, way worse corruption on the local level. So I think that these are things you have to take by case basis, but specifically Lenin drives the point over and over again that that sort of dual federalism where basically the states have their rights, the government has their rights, and they're equally powerful. That really just promotes corruption and lack of accountability, because everyone can name the president, everyone can hold the president responsible. How many people can name the chairman of their local mud board?
Exactly.
Or all these special local government committees. And it's way harder to hold people accountable when you don't even know who they are.
Exactly.
It's really created these sort of shadow governments.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see that so often in America. I mean, even around voting. I mean, in some areas, I mean, I think it's asinine when you have elections, but they don't coordinate with like the primary election. So it's almost because
Yes.
people don't focus on politics every but 4 years. You have to be like people like us who are like political junkies who just like consume this stuff. That's when oh, there's an election coming up. There's this coming up. There's this board meeting coming up. And so, when you don't know this, like you're saying, you have these shadow governments. Most people don't know who their local officials are, who their city councilmen are.
When we talk about things that we can do as solutions, how can we fix this problem now? And I think that is an excellent point. I think it would be an incredible thing to advocate for going to the future, something that is, I think, realistically attainable, to try to consolidate more elections. Really in November, I think would be ideal. There's no reason that we'll have three, there's if somebody dies, I think there's situations where special elections can be necessary, or somebody is impeached, situations like that. But in generally speaking, we don't need to have an election in November and an election in March every single year. People can't keep track of this stuff. We should have a holiday where everyone gets off work, gets paid for being off work, and goes out and does their civic duty, which is to go vote. because if people aren't actually voting, if people aren't paying attention, there's no way that our democracy can actually thrive.
Exactly. And that is such an important point, Ben. If you aren't active in your government, then you don't know what you have people making these decisions, and they don't have your best interest at hand. Only you have your own best interest at hand. And so that's one of the main things we try and preach on the show is being politically involved, becoming politically active, and just gaining political knowledge, because I mean this is how our system functions. And people want to know why things go wrong. Well, it's because you have bad officials. I mean that's half of it. There's some, there is personal responsibility, but I mean, like things like not getting paid enough. That's your government. That's and that you can say that's a little bit on you, but I mean, even working, you still have to survive, and that's the thing. They're not paying us livable wages.
It's unacceptable, and it doesn't have to be that way.
So let's get back to Leninism, man.
Yeah. So yeah, I have a few different points. I already touched on Lenin's criticisms of revolving door politics. The way that the financial institutions totally just overwhelm any attempts at democracy in our sorts of liberal republics, which are defined by that entrenched bureaucratic control. But yeah, so I mean, I have a lot of other points here we can talk about. His critiques of parliamentarism. We could talk about when to advocate for democratic socialism versus, when, people say that you should just advocate for like full socialism, full communism, whatever you want to call it. We could talk about, violence and socialism, and what that means as far as creating a less violent society. Or we could just try to talk about some dispelling some misconceptions about what Leninism means. I also have some notes about really explaining the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's a word from Marx originally, and then very, very important to Leninism that gets thrown around a lot as like scare tactics. And then, you have the other right-wing smear, how socialism just wants to make everyone poor, but all of these points Lenin addresses in the State and Revolution, so we can kind of start wherever you want there.
Let's go with demything Leninism, because I think that's where we got to start, because there's just so much propaganda, because that's really what it is. There's so much propaganda against this stuff. So we gotta debunk it. So let's start with that.
Yeah. So here on page 76, you hear about how socialists, Venezuela, socialists just want to make everyone poor. They want to pay everybody the same, but they want to make everybody equally poor. But that was actually that like really just bankrupt, like not all the way there conception of economics. That's utopian socialism. But the way Marx and Lenin tried to approach socialism was through a scientific lens that was incredibly economic. Marx wrote tomes on this stuff. He wasn't a dum-dum.
Yeah.
He was highly engaged and very methodical, very mathematical when trying to analyze how the fruits of the workers' labor needs to be distributed in a society. So he said right here on page 76, Lenin quotes him at length. With socialism, people will say it's about equitable distribution and, quote, the equal right of all to an equal product of labor. But Marx, he exposes this mistake, Lenin says. He says, all law implies inequality. All law is an application of an equal measure to different people who in fact are not alike, are not equal to one another, which is why quote unquote equal right is a violation of equality and an injustice, because Marx says people are not alike. One is strong, another is weak. One is married, another is not. One has more children, another has less, and so on. Lenin says the conclusion Marx draws is, quote, with an equal performance of labor and hence an equal share in the social consumption fund. And now this is getting a little bit, in the weeds on theory, but I'll finish this and then we can kind of like talk about what it means.
Yeah.
So Marx says with an equal performance of labor and hence an equal share in the social consumption fund, one will in fact receive more than another. One will be richer than another, and so on. To avoid all of these defects, the right, instead of being equal, would have to be unequal. The first phase of communism, therefore, cannot yet provide justice and equality. Differences and unjust differences in wealth will still persist. So that's the first phase of communism. Marx is talking about socialism. That's what we're trying to fight for. We're not trying to jump straight to communism. Anybody that's a serious Leninist, a serious Marxist-Leninist, they're not trying to get communism tomorrow. People like the Black Panther Party, Angela Davis, serious, principled Marxists, they understand that you have to take things one step at a time. But it's about dreaming that a better future is possible. It's about approaching politics from a place of positivity and not of nihilism.
Yeah.
Just to finish, Marx says, the difference is that wealth will still persist, but the exploitation of man by man will have become impossible, because it will be impossible to seize the means of production, the factories, machines, land, etc., and make them private property. Private property being, these capital resources being owned by a few small individuals. The fact that at Amazon, the workers are not empowered to own their own workplace, to be in charge of the things they produce, but it's really a dictatorship, especially without strong unions. But yeah, so that's a pretty dense quote to read into, but I think that pretty clearly shows that Marx was very well aware that, until we basically solve scarcity, until, we just have infinite amount of stuff and everyone has as much stuff as they need, there are going to be differences. And, somebody that's been on the job for 30 years, has a family of 4, they're going to make more money than, some kid, fresh out of high school. I think that's like one thing. People will criticize unions about the good old boy system and how difficult it was to get ahead back then. But you look back in the 60s, and like, while that might be true, you also had a situation where one income could support a family of 4. And, I think that's a lot preferable to having 2 parents working 40 hours a week and still can barely pay for their kids' cancer treatment. I don't know. What are some of your thoughts or questions on that? Because it's a lot to analyze.
Cause yeah, man, that's a lot to unpack. Well, look here. This is how I'm seeing it. I'm seeing it as like communism. Like communism is like when we have like automation, like when the robots can do anything and everything. And so that's kind of like a utopia. And so people don't even, when people hear communism, they just think of, oh my God, I'm gonna lose all my stuff. There's just all these bad connotations with it. And I'm just thinking of it as like, man, there's just so much stuff to just try and unpack. And when you just have these big institutions like you were saying, but like Fox and all these people who can control the narrative, it's
Yeah.
just so hard to just I guess just beat back that beast. And so I was just
Yeah.
thinking, I was just like, man, it's just a lot.
Well, and you look at the difference between, you know, more authoritarian socialism and quote unquote less authoritarian socialism. Perfect example of like the differences in like prosperity. You know, people will like to point to East Germany as an example of the abject failures of socialism or communism versus the great successes of capitalism in West Berlin. But one thing that's like never acknowledged by these people is throughout a huge bulk of the time that the Berlin Wall was up, West Germany was actually controlled by the Social Democrats, which was a Marxist party. You know, and people don't like to acknowledge that. There have been like lots of very successful examples of Marxism put to practice, and it's just a question of making sure that our democratic institutions are actually democratic. And so that's I understand you know why Bernie likes to specify things about democratic socialism as opposed to just socialism, but really in spirit, just socialism has to be democratic.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's like the nature of it. That's basically
Yeah.
the nature of it. And so it's just, man, and to me, that's why I talk on the show when I talk to people. I always try to get them to understand like these political labels that we just it's just words at the end of the day. Like it's almost, unless you do the concrete research. I mean, anybody can tell you anything, and they just go along with it. I mean, and that's why I say it's always about policy. It's policy, policy, policy. It's
Yes.
what are you going to do for the people? How are you going to help the people? And it's like those are like the political styles that are for the people, that help out, that help the people, that help the working class. And it's just like here in America, we've been taught like, oh no, those are scary things. So it's like,
Yeah.
you know, we've been fed propaganda that you like the working class man and woman, they shouldn't get as much. And so it's just baffling, man.
Yeah, and when you get down to the, you know, as we've kind of already talked about, the meats and potatoes of Leninism, it's just those 2 points that we need to smash this bureaucracy as it exists today, because, and it does still exist today, the actual, the root structure of the American government has actually changed like pretty little since 1917. And then the other part being that if we want to be, you know, Marxist-Leninist, Marxist, if we want to be principled socialists, is what I would say, we have to be opposed to that military-industrial complex that Lenin mentioned defines liberalism. You can't be a socialist. You can't be a progressive. You can't be revolutionary. You can't even be on the left if you are not anti-war.
Exactly. And and I think, there's a lot of criticism coming out against Biden because, he's continuing the war machine. Those are good criticisms of him because the American people. I mean, we're facing war at home. We have war and poverty going on. We have minorities against the cops. I mean, there's so many COVID. I mean, there's just so many things that we can address at home. Why are we spending $50 billion, $750 billion a year on foreign wars when our infrastructure gets a grade of D. Flint, Michigan still doesn't have clean drinking water. Houston doesn't even have clean drinking water. So I'm just saying, why are we so focused on this? And I've done a little bit of research on Leninism, and I know he talked heavily against imperialism, and that's what that is. That it's just, and a lot of people don't like to admit, but like the wars in the Middle East, it was just for, I mean, at the end of the day, it was for resources. And after so long, they have to release those documents. And when people really go through a fine tooth comb with those documents, and you really start to read, like they were getting they were counting on warlords to bring them people, and the warlords were just bringing them anybody. So
Yeah.
you're not even doing war right. And so you're losing men, women, and children, and just a generation. We've been over there for 20 years. That's crazy. That's asinine.
It is. It's so self-destructive, um, that it seems to go against all sort of like conventional wisdom about what it means to be conservative. Because when conservatives try to market themselves, they'll say, they're rational, or they're realistic, but uh, yeah, there's nothing sustainable about forever wars. It's
Exactly.
the only way it's temporarily, the dominoes keep from falling over is by perpetually finding new resources to plunder. That's like, you know, Margaret Thatcher said, the problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money, but really the problem with capitalism is that eventually you run out of wars. And
Exactly.
um, that's you know that's what happens. Like every time we try to end a conflict, um, we do see the U.S. taking a major economic hit from that because we slow down wartime production. We're not producing just like pointless stuff, and we're not getting resources essentially for free. So yeah, that's always gonna have a major economic blowback.
And that's almost a scary thought, when your economy is so heavily based on war. So it's like, what happens after that? What happens when? Because we can't continue war forever. Because I remember on Fox a couple of years ago, Lindsey Graham, like they were talking about it, and he's like, "You don't get out," and I'm like, "So my grandkids, their grandkids, we're all supposed to just." Is that like our that's like a warp to me, that's like a warped sense of like sacrifice to the country. Like you
It's a death cult.
sacrifice. Yeah, it's like a death cult. That's really what it is. The
Yeah,
Republican Party is really close to a death cult. I can honestly say that.
yeah. And yeah, I think definitely from a cultural lens, I'm very glad that I voted for Joe Biden in this recent election. Um, but from like, strictly from a policy perspective,
Oh yeah.
um, already in a lot of ways, he's been a massive disappointment, which I'm not surprised by. There was, I don't know if you remember that meme going around of Kamala Harris um, before the election where she's like waving or whatever. Do you remember that?
I kind of remember that a little bit.
Yeah, well, so it was actually taken outside of a ICE detention facility in Florida. Um, or no, it wasn't ICE. It was a private. They were partnered with ICE, but it was a private detention facility
Oh.
for migrant children in Florida. And she was basically mourning them being locked up in this prison. Um, and just recently, this afternoon, I heard on the Majority Report that the Biden administration is looking to reopen that same facility. That they acted like they were so opposed to locking up kids in cages, which they have. There have been some tangible results on that front. I think it's good that we're not separating children from their parents anymore. The
Mhm.
fact that these kids at this Florida facility, you know, whether they were unaccompanied or not, they shouldn't be thrown in a private prison. They should be thrown in childcare until we figure out where their parents are or where their aunt or uncle are. these aren't criminals, these are children, and it's just totally unconscionable that this can be allowed to happen. So that's definitely anybody watching this. If you live in Florida, if you don't live in Florida, I don't have the name of the facility at the top of my head, but you should be able to find it pretty easy with a quick Google search. Just look up reopening Florida detention facility and try to reach out to those local representatives and any way that we can put pressure on the Biden administration to keep those private prisons closed. I think that's a really important task for us to keep pressure on.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that I preach the most is keeping your foot on their necks, man. Like that's a football term. Like you have to stay on these people. They work for us. They take our tax dollars every year, every day. We pay taxes on everything. I want something for my tax dollars. You watching this, you should want something for your tax dollars. Every American should want something for their tax dollars. You're giving money to them. We want our services. We want healthcare. We want in the wars. We want legalization of drugs. These are things. I mean, we're living here in America. That's what we definitely need. But Ben, because man, I feel like we can go on this forever. But I really want to ask you something before you go.
Yeah.
What can we do? What can you say for like maybe someone in politics that may be a Marxist, a Leninist, a socialist? What would be your political advice to them?
If somebody calls themselves some form of socialist, if they consider themselves revolutionary, I think definitely that there's two main pieces of advice. One is don't compromise on your anti-war stance. We can do that through direct action. We can do that, through writing letters. We can do that through running our own campaigns. But we need to make it clear that the U.S. public is not okay with these forever wars. And then number two, I really think, to appreciate the words of Vladimir Lenin and really get back to what he was trying to say socialism should be about. Mm-hmm. We have to remember those ideas that the people we elect should essentially be a working body. They shouldn't just be in the business of talking about laws, but they should be in the business of actually doing things. So the people that we elect, they have to be anti-war and they have to do things. And yeah, I mean, so we do need to we need to see material gains for the working class, because if that doesn't happen, then people are just gonna lose faith, and we're never gonna get anywhere we're never gonna get anywhere if we can't take that first step. And that's how this is really where the future is going, is just one step at a time.
I think you said it all, man. I think we cannot compromise. I don't think we on the anti-war thing or anything. And I think with just politicians in general, they compromise too much. It's almost like they're afraid of their own shadow. And I really like that, man. Like anybody listening to this who might think of themselves as a future politician or a Leninist or a socialist or a Marxist or just anybody, do not compromise. Do not compromise on your beliefs, on what you feel is right for the people. Don't compromise on what the people are saying, because at the end of the day, that's what the whole entire government, that's what our government is about, helping the people. So
yeah. Can I say one last thing?
Oh yeah, man, go ahead.
Yeah, on that subject, it's the thing is you don't have to compromise. People always pretend like you have to compromise, but there's an alternative. The only way to get past legislation is not through compromise. It's also through building coalitions. So Like the secret to passing a $15 an hour minimum wage doesn't have to be allowing, this vote to send another $1 billion for Saudi Arabia to bomb Yemen. What you can actually do, as an elected independent or a Democrat, this is me speaking to the AOCs, the Bernie Sanders of the world, the people that are actually interested in helping Americans. What they should be doing is seeking coalitions. And I think Bernie actually does a really good job of this, is searching out those Republicans. Someone like Rand Paul, he says he claims he's committed to privacy. So that's an area where we wouldn't be compromising, but we would be building a coalition, finding those points of common ground. Because very, very few Republicans in office are just total sociopaths that have zero responsibility to do anything good for their constituents. There's at the very least those peanuts, and like those are the things that we can really seize on and use against them. Find those commonalities and use them to force through our own agenda.
Yes, yeah, coalition building, man. Yes, and not compromising. I love that. That is definitely a good message. That's a good message for the people. That's something I think people can take that and they can build upon that. I like that, man. So
well,
guys,
thank you.
So guys, I want to thank I want to thank Ben for being on. We're gonna put Ben's social links in the description. So if y'all have questions for Ben, y'all can go ahead and ask him. But before we go, so don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe and comment and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any uploads. Also, you can find us anywhere where you can listen to podcasts. Thank you very much.